We all know that World War II was one of the largest conflicts in human history, and Japanese soldiers played a significant role in that war. During World War II, thousands of Japanese pilots made the ultimate sacrifice for their country by becoming weapons or suicide tools by crashing their planes into Allied ships. While their targets were mainly ships, there were also cases where these pilots crashed their planes into military bases or other strategic installations. According to information and rumors, kamikaze pilots willingly sacrificed their lives, even under immense pressure to do so. But this raises the mystery of why these individuals were so willing to give up their lives in such a way. Did they truly volunteer to sacrifice themselves for the greater good, as wartime propaganda claimed, or were they forced to do so? Also, why did the Japanese military specifically employ such tactics? But before we continue, don't forget to subscribe first. I'll give you 5 seconds to click the subscribe button. Once you're done, let's continue. The term kamikaze is a Japanese word meaning divine wind. This term originally referred to a typhoon that destroyed the Mongol fleet attacking Japan in 1281. Kamikaze pilots adopted this name during World War II in an attempt to invoke the same divine protection. According to information, the first kamikaze mission took place on September 13, 1944. A group of pilots from the 31st Army Air Squadron on Negros Island decided to launch a suicide attack. First Lieutenant Takashi Kosei and a sergeant carried 2 100 kg bombs in their aircraft and planned to crash into an aircraft carrier. However, there are also sources that mention Admiral Masafumi Arima as the initiator or inventor of the kamikaze tactic. Arima is known to have led an attack with twin-engine Mitsubishi G4M bombers against the Essex and USS Franklin aircraft carriers near Leyte Gulf, around October 15, 1944. Arima was reported to have been killed, and some of the planes crashed into the Franklin. Despite the fact that suicide attacks were carried out to show respect for the emperor or as voluntary acts, the actual reason why the pilots took such actions was due to frustration and pressure from the advancing Allied forces, especially the United States. In other words, they were desperate enemies who were unable to stop the relentless progress of the Americans. They saw suicide attacks as a last resort to halt the enemy. So why did Japan resort to creating the specialized kamikaze forces, and why were so many willing to sacrifice their lives by crashing their planes? Towards the end of World War II, when the American invasion of Japan seemed imminent, Vice Admiral Onishi Takejiro devised the Takotai operation, which involved airplanes, gliders, and submarine torpedoes. Onishi and his right-hand man believed that the Japanese spirit, believed to possess a unique strength to face death without hesitation, was the only available way for Japan to achieve miracles and save their homeland, which was surrounded by America. Looking at the situation, the Japanese military leaders were actually desperate. They were outmatched in weaponry, outnumbered in troops, and their technology was far behind that of the United States. If we go back to 1942, in July of that year, Japan lost more aviators than they were able to train in a full year before the war. Going back to the beginning, to realize the ambition of the Takotai, Onishi approached his superiors to request the creation of a suicide force and was granted permission with one condition: he was only allowed to recruit volunteers. Onishi also stated, "In our current situation, I am strongly convinced that the only way to turn the tide of war in our favor is by using diving attacks with our planes. There is no other way. There will be more than enough volunteers for this opportunity to save our country, and I want to lead such an operation. Give me 300 planes, and I will change the course of the war." When this operation began in October 1944, not a single officer who had been trained at the military academy volunteered to serve as pilots. They all knew very well that the mission held no meaning and would end in death. Of the approximately 4,000 Takotai pilots, about 3,000 of them were young pilots drawn from newly recruited soldiers, and the remaining 1,000 were university students who were quickly graduated by the government to be included in the recruitment list. Saburo Sakai, a Japanese pilot who became a Gakitsuio of the Imperial Japanese Navy, stated in an interview, "Even now, the faces of many of my students appear when I close my eyes. So many students have gone. Why did headquarters continue these foolish attacks for 10 months? Foolish. Everyone lied that everyone volunteered for the kamikaze unit. They lied." Furthermore, many of the child soldiers who eventually became kamikaze pilots experienced brutal treatment during their training, to the point where, based on first-hand accounts from the trainees, many of them lost their sense of patriotism. For example, Arakawa Daikichi stated that he was violently struck in the face repeatedly until my face was unrecognizable. "I was struck so hard that I couldn't see and fell to the floor. As soon as I got up, I was hit again with a stick." The Japanese's intention behind such cruel treatment was to ignite the fighting spirit within the soldiers, but in reality, it only resulted in the loss of nationalism among these young individuals. Under the rule of Hideki Tojo, university education was shortened, and newly graduated students were immediately recruited into the military. Upon arriving at the bases, many of them experienced harsh physical punishments every day. Some of them initially had patriotic spirits before being obligated, but life at the bases dampened any enthusiasm for combat. So, how did they convince these young men to voluntarily join the suicide missions? Some men were recruited into the program through a simple questionnaire. The questionnaire consisted of a single multiple-choice question asking, "Do you greatly want/do not want to be involved in kamikaze attacks?" The men only needed to circle the statement they most agreed with. However, on the other hand, the pressure on the young men to do something for their country at that time was immense, and the threat of retaliation if they refused was very real, as well as the fear of possible reprisals not only against the soldier himself but also his family at home. Another method used to encourage the men to volunteer was by placing them in a room filled with their peers, and after listening to long speeches about patriotism, the unwilling members were ordered to step forward. Besides loyalty to the country and emperor, few wanted to appear so cowardly or face the shame of not being willing to die when their fellow soldiers were sacrificing their lives to protect the homeland. But what happened to those who were unwilling to join voluntarily? Those who didn't join would be sent to the battlefields in the south, and there were also peculiarities such as those who didn't want to join suddenly finding their names on the volunteer list, and their superiors proudly reporting that all members of their corps had willingly volunteered. After the pilots were selected, the officers in charge of the specific corps decided who would carry out the missions and in what order they would depart. Often, children of important political or military officials, prominent businessmen, and members of the royal family would volunteer without ever being chosen to fly towards their deaths. On the other hand, soldiers with mechanical skills, navigation skills, and other important pilot skills were preferred for selection. Those who were deemed physically fit were placed under greater pressure to volunteer. Throughout their journey, especially at military bases, the minds and hearts of these soldier students were torn apart by tormenting conflicts. Some pilots were so tormented by the looming thoughts of death that they prayed for their time to come soon to end their suffering. Although there are many testimonies, photos, and films showing pilots smiling while saluting or waving as they departed on their final missions, there is a story written on June 21, 1995, by Kasuga Takeo. Kasuga was not a Takotai pilot, but rather an officer responsible for food, laundry, room cleaning, and other daily tasks for the Takotai pilots at Chuchiura Naval Air Base. In the letter, Kasuga recounts that on the night before their final flight, the Takotai pilots experienced intense inner conflicts. They drank cold sake, and the atmosphere became chaotic, with some of them expressing their emotions by damaging the surrounding items. Some danced while smashing flower vases, shouted in anger, and cried loudly. They thought about their families, loved ones, and fiancés, contemplating the great sacrifice they would make the following morning. Despite their attempts to strengthen themselves in dedication to the Imperial Japan and the Emperor, the inner conflicts they experienced were incredibly difficult to express in words. A Takotai pilot named Ichizo Hayashi wrote a letter in April 1945, a few days before his death. He wrote, "I am honored to have been chosen as a member of the Special Attack Force heading into battle, but I cannot hold back my tears when I think of you, Mother. As I contemplate the hopes you have for my future, I feel incredibly sad that I will die without doing anything to make you happy." After hearing about the suffering of these pilots, you must be curious about the effectiveness of the kamikaze program for the Japanese. According to the United States Air Force, nearly 3,000 kamikaze attacks were carried out, resulting in damaging 368 ships, sinking 34 ships, killing 4,900 Navy personnel, and injuring another 4,800. However, only about 14% of kamikaze pilots successfully hit a ship. One of the largest kamikaze programs conducted by Japan took place between April and June 1945 in the Battle of Okinawa. On April 6, 1945, waves of aircraft launched hundreds of attacks in Operation Kikusui. Kamikaze attacks initially targeted Allied destroyer ships on scouting duties, then shifted to aircraft carriers in the midst of the fleet. Suicide attacks using planes or boats in Okinawa successfully sank or disabled at least 30 U.S. warships and at least 3 U.S. merchant ships, as well as several ships from other Allied forces. In total, around 1,465 aircraft were used in these attacks. Here is the sad story of a special kamikaze pilot. Share this cool video with your friends. Thank you and see you later.